finished running through my mental checklist one more time, making sure I had everything we'd need for the next 2 nights in the wilderness. The van's engine ticked as it cooled down in the Pine Ridge parking area, and I could hear my clients shuffling around behind me, probably getting their first real look at where we'd be spending the weekend. "All right, everyone gather around the back of the van," I called out, pulling my own pack from the rear cargo area. The weight felt familiar in my hands. 22 pounds of gear I could trust my life to. I'd been doing this job for 3 years now, and the routine still felt good. Check the equipment twice, brief the clients, keep them safe, bring them home with stories to tell. Natalie and Tommy were already standing close to the vehicle, both of them practically vibrating with excitement. Natalie kept looking around at the tree line like she expected to see a bear walk out any second, which honestly wasn't impossible but not likely at this time of day. Tommy had his phone out, probably trying to get his last few texts sent before we moved into the dead zone. The Salazar family took longer to join us. Wesley looked like he was second-guessing this whole adventure as he helped his wife Violet adjust her camera bag strap. She seemed more optimistic, already taking pictures of the trailhead sign and the wooden information board that listed local wildlife. Their son Albert stood next to their pile of gear with his arms crossed, staring at his backpack like it had personally wronged him. "This is going to be amazing," Natalie said, bouncing slightly on her toes. "I've been reading about this area for weeks. Did you know there are supposed to be old Native American sites scattered throughout these woods?" "Some of that's true," I said, slinging my pack over my shoulders and adjusting the straps. "We'll stick to the marked trails and designated camping areas, but I can point out some interesting features along the way." Wesley cleared his throat. "Are we talking about anything dangerous? I mean, should we be concerned about disturbing anything we shouldn't?" "The trails we're taking are well established and perfectly safe," I told him. "We're not going anywhere we're not supposed to be. This is a standard 2-day wilderness experience. Hiking, camping, basic outdoor skills. Nothing extreme." Albert finally spoke up. "How heavy is this thing supposed to be?" He gestured at his backpack without making any move to pick it up. "Depends what you packed," I said. "Did you follow the gear list I sent?" "Mom packed it," he muttered. Violet laughed. "I may have included a few extra snacks and an extra jacket and maybe some other things. The good news is it'll get lighter as we eat the food," I said. "But let's go over the basic safety rules before we head out." I ran through my standard briefing. Stay with the group. Let me know immediately if anyone feels unwell or uncomfortable. Don't eat anything unless I identify it first. And keep noise to a reasonable level so we don't disturb the wildlife. Tommy put his phone away and actually paid attention, which was more than I could say for some clients. Albert looked bored but nodded at the right moments. "What kind of animals might we see?" Natalie asked. "I mean, besides the obvious ones like deer and squirrels." "Black bears are possible but not common on this particular trail. More likely we'll see raccoons, maybe some foxes if we're quiet. Plenty of birds. The creek we're camping near usually has some interesting insect life, if you're into that sort of thing." "What about the local legends you mentioned?" Natalie pressed. "I read something about old stories from this area." I hesitated. Bodhi had mentioned that some clients enjoyed hearing about local folklore, but he'd also been clear about not getting too deep into anything that might make people nervous. "There are some old stories, sure. Most wilderness areas have them. I can share a few around the campfire if people are interested." "That sounds perfect," Violet said, adjusting her camera settings. "Very atmospheric." "All right, everyone ready?" I asked, looking around the group. "It's about a 90-minute hike to our campsite. Mostly uphill for the first half, but nothing too steep. We'll take breaks when people need them." Albert finally picked up his pack with an exaggerated grunt. "This is ridiculous." "You'll be fine," his father said, though Wesley didn't look entirely convinced about his own pack situation. I led them to the trailhead where a wooden sign marked the beginning of the Pine Ridge Loop Trail. The path started wide and well-maintained, winding through mixed forest that was just starting to show some early fall color. The afternoon air was cool but not cold. Perfect hiking weather. The trees here are mostly oak and maple, with some pine mixed in, I explained as we walked. Good habitat diversity, which is why we see so many different animal species. Natalie stayed close behind me, asking questions about every plant and rock formation we passed. She had genuine curiosity, not the fake enthusiasm some clients put on to seem outdoorsy. Tommy hung back with the Salazar family, making conversation with Wesley about work and normal life stuff. About 20 minutes in, I stopped at a cluster of wild berry bushes to show them what to look for. These are elderberries, safe to eat when they're dark purple like this, but you want to avoid anything that's still red or green. "Can we try some?" Natalie asked. "Sure, just a few. They're pretty tart." While they sampled the berries, I noticed Albert had found a fallen log to sit on and was already looking tired. His pack did seem oversized for his frame, but he'd need to adjust. Part of the experience was learning to handle some discomfort. "How much farther?" he asked. "About an hour," I said. "The trail levels out in another 10 minutes or so." We kept moving, and I pointed out animal tracks in the softer soil near a small creek crossing. Clear deer prints, and what might have been a fox trail leading into the underbrush. Violet took pictures of everything, including some decent shots of a hawk circling overhead. "Cooper, what's that?" Natalie asked, pointing off the trail to our left. I followed her gaze and saw what she was looking at, a circular arrangement of stones, maybe 6 feet across, sitting in a small clearing about 20 yards from the trail. The stones were roughly the same size, placed with obvious intention. I'd hiked this trail dozens of times and had never noticed it before. "Huh," I said, studying the formation. "I'm not sure. Could be something left by previous campers or maybe something older." "Can we look at it?" she asked. "From here is fine. We don't want to disturb anything and we need to keep moving if we want to reach camp before it gets dark." But I kept looking at the stone circle as we walked past. The placement was too deliberate to be random, and the stones themselves looked like they'd been there for a while. Moss grew on several of them, and fallen leaves had collected in the center. Something about it felt significant, though I couldn't say why. The trail continued climbing gradually through dense forest. Albert's complaints became more frequent, but he kept moving. Wesley offered to take some weight from his son's pack, but Albert refused with typical teenage stubbornness. "Look at this," Violet called out, camera already raised. "These trees are gorgeous." She was photographing a grove of old-growth oaks, their massive trunks twisted and scarred by decades of weather. The canopy overhead blocked most of the late afternoon light, creating a natural cathedral effect that did look pretty impressive. "Some of these trees are probably over 100 years old," I told them. "They were here long before any of the trails were cut." "It makes you think about everything they've seen," Natalie said, running her hand along the bark of the nearest oak. "Mom, can we please keep moving?" Albert asked. "This pack is killing me." "We're almost there," I said, checking my watch. We'd been hiking for about 70 minutes, which put us right on schedule. Maybe 15 more minutes. The final stretch of trail descended slightly toward the creek, and I could smell the water before I heard it. The designated campsite sat in a natural clearing beside Willow Creek, with level ground for tents and a fire ring that previous groups had built from local stones. "This is it," I announced as we emerged from the tree line. "Home for the next 2 nights." The site was perfect, close enough to the creek for water access, but far enough back to avoid any flooding issues. Mature trees provided natural windbreaks, and there was plenty of space for 5 tents with room left over. "Oh, this is lovely," Violet said, already taking pictures. "Where should we set up?" Wesley asked, dropping his pack with obvious relief. "Tents go in that flatter area over there," I said, pointing to the obvious spot. "Try to spread out a bit so everyone has some privacy. I'll get started on the fire ring and then help anyone who needs it." Tommy immediately started unpacking his tent, then stopped and stared at the collection of poles and stakes like they were written in a foreign language. Cooper? I think I need some help here." "No problem. Let me just get my own stuff sorted first." I set up my tent quickly, muscle memory taking over. 3-person dome tent, even though it was just me. The extra space was worth the slightly increased weight. While I worked, I watched the others tackle their own gear with varying degrees of success. Albert surprised me by actually helping Tommy figure out his tent poles instead of complaining about his own situation. The kid had some good instincts when he forgot to be miserable. Wesley and Violet worked together efficiently, clearly having done this before. Natalie took the longest to start setting up her tent because she kept getting distracted by the campsite itself. She walked the entire perimeter, examining trees and collecting interesting rocks. Normal enough behavior, though she seemed unusually focused on the details. "Natalie, you might want to get your tent up before it gets much darker," I called out. "Right, sorry, I just love exploring new places." She finally started unpacking her gear, but I noticed she kept glancing around the site like she was looking for something specific. Probably just excited to be here. Some people took a while to settle into the wilderness rhythm. I got the fire ring ready and gathered some kindling from the immediate area. The creek provided a steady background sound that would help everyone sleep, and the clearing felt secure without being claustrophobic. Good campsite selection was half the battle in keeping clients comfortable. "Cooper!" Natalie's voice carried from across the campsite, high and excited. "Come look at this." I looked up from the fire ring to see her standing near a large oak tree about 50 yards away, at the edge of the clearing. She was waving me over, practically jumping up and down with whatever she'd found. "What is it?" I called back. "Just come see. You have to see this." I dropped the bundle of kindling beside the fire ring and headed toward the oak tree where Natalie was still waving me over. Her excitement was infectious, even from this distance. Whatever she'd found had her practically vibrating with energy. "What's got her so worked up?" Tommy called from where he was wrestling with tent stakes. "No idea," I replied, walking across the uneven ground toward her. "Probably found an interesting rock or something." As I got closer, though, I could see Natalie wasn't looking down at the ground. She was looking straight ahead at the massive oak trunk, her hands pressed together in front of her chest like she was trying to contain her excitement. The tree was easily 4 feet across, with thick bark and gnarled roots that spread out in all directions. "Cooper, look at this," she said when I was still 10 feet away. Her voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" I followed her line of sight and stopped dead in my tracks. Propped against the base of the oak tree, sitting upright with its back against the rough bark, was a doll. But not just any doll. This thing was the size of a real child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, and from where I stood it looked disturbingly lifelike. "What the hell?" I muttered, taking a few more steps closer. The doll was positioned as if someone had carefully arranged it there, legs stretched out in front, arms resting naturally at its sides. It wore a pale yellow dress with tiny white flowers printed on the fabric, and the dress looked clean and new. No stains, no tears, no signs of weathering despite being out here in the woods. But it was the face that really got to me. The features were incredibly detailed, almost photographic in their realism. The skin had a subtle pink flush to the cheeks, and the lips were a soft rose color that looked like they might be warm to the touch. The hair wasn't the synthetic stuff you'd expect on a toy either. It looked real, falling in soft brown waves to just below the shoulders, with individual strands catching the filtered sunlight. "Someone's idea of a joke, maybe," I said, though my voice came out rougher than I intended. Natalie took another step closer, and I instinctively reached out to catch her arm. "Careful. We don't know who left it here or why." The doll's eyes were what really bothered me. They were glass, I could tell that much, but they had depth to them that made them look almost alive. Brown eyes with flecks of gold, and they seemed to track my movement as I shifted position. I knew it was just the angle and the way the light hit them, but the effect was unsettling as hell. "Look at the craftsmanship," Natalie breathed. "This isn't some cheap toy from a store. Someone put serious work into making this." She was right. Every detail was perfect, from the delicate eyelashes to the tiny fingernails painted with clear polish. The dress had hand-stitched seams and real buttons made of what looked like mother of pearl. Even the shoes were impressive, little black patent leather Mary Janes that looked like they'd been custom-made. "Hey, what's going on over there?" Wesley's voice carried across the campsite. I turned to see the whole group looking in our direction now, curious about what had captured our attention. "Just found something weird," I called back. "Come take a look." Tommy was the first to reach us, followed by Wesley, Violet, and Albert. They formed a loose semicircle around the tree, all of them staring at the doll with varying degrees of surprise and confusion. "Okay, that's creepy as hell," Tommy said with a nervous laugh. "Who brings a doll camping?" "Maybe some family was here before us," Wesley suggested, though he sounded doubtful. "Could be someone's child left it behind by accident." Violet had her camera out and was already taking pictures. It's actually quite beautiful in an artistic sense. The level of detail is remarkable. Albert just stood there with his arms crossed, looking annoyed. "Can we get back to setting up camp? It's just a doll." But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a doll. The positioning was too deliberate, too careful. Someone had placed it here specifically, arranged it to look like a child sitting peacefully against the tree. The question was why. "We should probably leave it alone," I said, my guide training kicking in. "If it belongs to someone, they might come back for it. And if it doesn't..." I trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. "Actually," Natalie said, and I could hear the excitement building in her voice again, "I think we should bring it back to camp with us." "What?" Wesley looked alarmed. "We can't just take someone's property. It's not stealing if it's been abandoned," Natalie argued. "And look around. There's no sign that anyone else has been here recently. No other campsites, no trash, no footprints except ours." She had a point about the footprints. The ground around the tree was soft enough that we would have seen evidence of other people if they'd been here recently. The only marks I could see were from our group and maybe some small animals. "I still don't think it's a good idea," I said. "Best practice is to leave things where you find them." But Natalie was already moving closer to the doll, reaching out like she wanted to touch it. I grabbed her wrist gently but firmly. "Don't," I said. "We don't know where it's been or what might be on it." "It looks clean," she protested. "Cleaner than it should be if it's been out here for any length of time." That was another thing that bothered me. The doll looked like it had been placed here recently, maybe even today. The dress was spotless, the hair was perfectly arranged, and there wasn't a speck of dirt or debris on it anywhere. But if someone had been here today, where were their tracks? "Maybe we should just take a picture and move on," Violet suggested diplomatically. "That way we have a record of it without disturbing anything." "Good idea," I agreed, relieved that someone else was being sensible about this. But Natalie shook her head stubbornly. "No, I want to bring it back to camp. Just for tonight. If someone comes looking for it, we can give it back. But I have this feeling." She paused, looking down at the doll with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I have this feeling it's supposed to come with us." "That doesn't make any sense," Tommy said. "Dolls don't have destinies." "How do you know?" Natalie shot back. "There are more things in this world than we understand. Maybe this is one of them." I could see Wesley getting more uncomfortable by the minute. "I really think we should leave it here," he said. "It feels wrong to take it." "It feels wrong to leave it," Natalie countered. "Look at it, it's like a real child sitting all alone out here. How can we just walk away?" The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. She was talking about the doll like it was alive, like it had feelings that could be hurt. That wasn't normal, even for someone as quirky as Natalie had shown herself to be. "It's not a real child," I said carefully. "It's a doll. An object. It doesn't have feelings." Natalie looked at me with something that might have been disappointment. "You don't know that for sure." Before anyone could stop her, she stepped forward and carefully lifted the doll from its position against the tree. It was bigger than I'd realized, probably close to 3 feet tall, and it must have weighed a decent amount because Natalie had to adjust her grip to support it properly. "There," she said, cradling it like you would an actual child. "See? No harm done." The doll's head lolled slightly to one side, and for a split second it looked like it was looking right at me. Those glass eyes caught the light in a way that made them seem aware, alert, almost curious. I blinked and the impression was gone, but the feeling lingered. "Can we please just get back to camp now?" Albert said. "This is getting weird." "Agreed," I said, though I kept my eyes on Natalie and the doll. "Let's head back." The walk back to the campsite was awkward. Natalie carried the doll carefully, supporting its head and making sure its dress didn't get caught on anything. The rest of us followed at a slight distance, nobody quite sure what to say. Tommy tried to lighten the mood with a joke about having an extra camper for dinner, but it fell flat. Wesley and Violet walked close together, speaking in low voices that I couldn't make out. Albert just looked annoyed at the whole situation. Back at camp, Natalie set the doll down gently beside her tent, propping it against her backpack so it was sitting upright. She fussed with the dress for a moment, smoothing out wrinkles and arranging the hair so it fell naturally over the shoulders. "There you go," she said softly, and I swear she was talking to the doll, not to any of us. "Much better." I decided to focus on getting the fire started and preparing for the wilderness skills demonstration I'd planned for the afternoon. Keeping busy would help me ignore the way Natalie kept glancing over at the doll, or how she'd positioned herself so she had a clear view of it while she worked on her tent. The fire caught easily with the dry kindling I'd gathered, and soon I had a nice bed of coals going. I called the group together for a lesson on fire safety and outdoor cooking techniques, pulling out my camp stove and demonstrating how to set up a stable cooking surface. Natalie participated in the lesson, asking good questions and taking notes in a small notebook she'd pulled from her pack. But every few minutes her attention would drift to the doll and she'd get this soft expression on her face like she was looking at something precious. "The key to camp cooking," I explained, heating water for a demonstration, "is keeping things simple and safe. You want to minimize the risk of burns or spills, especially when you're dealing with limited water for cleanup." "What about foraging?" Natalie asked. "You showed us those berries earlier. Are there other things we could find around here?" "Some," I admitted, "but foraging requires a lot of knowledge and experience. It's easy to make mistakes that could make you sick or worse. Better to stick with the food you brought." As the afternoon wore on, I noticed that Natalie had moved the doll twice. First, she'd repositioned it so it was facing our little circle during the cooking lesson. Then, when we took a break, she'd carried it over to a fallen log and propped it up there, adjusting its position until it had what she seemed to consider the best view of our activities. Each time she moved it, she was gentle and deliberate, like she was handling something fragile and important. The care she took was starting to make everyone else uncomfortable. I caught Wesley and Violet exchanging worried looks, and Tommy had stopped making jokes altogether. When we started preparing dinner, Natalie brought the doll with her to the cooking area. She set it on the ground beside where she was working, angled so it appeared to be watching her chop vegetables for the group meal. "Looks like you've got a little helper there," Violet said, trying to keep her tone light. Natalie glanced down at the doll and smiled. "She's very well behaved, just sits quietly and watches everything." The way she said "she" instead of "it" made my stomach tighten. I'd been hoping this was just Natalie being eccentric, maybe playing up the weirdness for attention or entertainment. But there was something in her voice now, a genuine affection that suggested she was starting to think of the doll as more than just an object. "Natalie," I said carefully, stirring the pot of stew we were sharing, "you know it's just a doll, right?" She looked up at me with a frown. "Of course I know that. I'm not stupid, Cooper. But that doesn't mean I can't appreciate the craftsmanship. Someone put a lot of love into making this." "Right," I said, though that wasn't really what I'd been getting at. "I just want to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," she said, but her tone had an edge to it now. Why wouldn't I be fine? Before I could answer, she turned back to the doll and her expression softened again. "Don't mind him," she said quietly. "Some people just don't understand." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. Natalie was talking to the doll like it could hear her, like it was a real person who might have feelings about what I'd said. That crossed a line from quirky into genuinely concerning. Tommy must have noticed it too, because he cleared his throat and said, "So, Cooper, what's the plan for after dinner? Any more wilderness wisdom to share?" I was grateful for the distraction. "I thought we'd do some basic knot tying and maybe talk about navigation techniques. Weather permitting, we'll do some stargazing later." "Sounds good," Wesley said, though he kept glancing nervously at Natalie and the doll. Albert might actually enjoy the astronomy part. Albert looked up from where he'd been poking at the fire with a stick. "Yeah, maybe, as long as we don't have to hike anywhere else today." The conversation moved on to safer topics, but I found myself watching Natalie out of the corner of my eye. She'd positioned herself so she could easily look down at the doll while she ate, and occasionally she'd pause mid-bite to adjust its hair or smooth its dress. At one point, when she thought no one was looking, I saw her lean down and whisper something to it. Her lips moved, but I couldn't make out the words. When she straightened up, she had this satisfied expression like she'd just had a pleasant conversation. I decided this had gone far enough. After we finished eating and started cleaning up, I approached her while the others were busy with their own tasks. "Natalie, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure," she said, but she didn't move away from the doll. "I'm a little concerned about how attached you're getting to that thing," I said, keeping my voice low so the others wouldn't overhear. "It's just a doll." Her jaw tightened. "You keep saying that. But you don't know what it is or where it came from any more than I do." "You're right," I admitted. "But I know what it looks like, and it looks like you're starting to treat it like it's alive." "Maybe because it feels alive," she said. "Maybe because some things can't be explained by your wilderness guide training." The hostility in her voice caught me off guard. Up until now, Natalie had been friendly and enthusiastic, eager to learn and participate in everything. This defensive anger was completely different. "I'm not trying to upset you," I said. "I'm just worried that you're getting a little too invested in something that might not be what it seems." "And what do you think it seems like?" she challenged. I looked down at the doll, with its perfect features and glass eyes that seemed to follow my movement. "I think it seems like someone's idea of a prank, or maybe some kind of art project that got left behind. But either way, it's not something we should be getting emotionally attached to." Natalie picked up the doll and held it protectively against her chest. "You don't understand," she said. "You can't feel what I feel when I look at her. She's been alone out here, just waiting for someone to care." "Dolls don't wait for anything," I said. "They don't have thoughts or feelings or needs." "How do you know?" she shot back. "How does anyone know what's real and what isn't? Just because something doesn't fit your idea of normal doesn't mean it's not valid." I could see this conversation wasn't going anywhere productive. Natalie had made up her mind about the doll, and nothing I said was going to change it. At least not tonight. "Okay," I said, raising my hands in surrender. "You're right. I don't know everything. Just be careful, all right? And if you start feeling like something's not right, let me know." She relaxed slightly. "Nothing's wrong, Cooper. Everything's exactly the way it should be. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was very much not the way it should be. Natalie's behavior was escalating, and I had no idea what to do about it. Part of me wanted to insist she leave the doll behind when we hiked out tomorrow, but I had a feeling that suggestion would go over about as well as my previous attempts at reason. For now, all I could do was keep an eye on the situation and hope that whatever was happening with Natalie would resolve itself before it became a real problem. The doll sat in Natalie's lap like she belonged there. I poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks drift up toward the canopy, while everyone settled into their camp chairs around the flames. The orange light flickered across faces, making everything feel cozy despite the weird tension that had been building all afternoon. Tommy stretched his legs out, boots almost touching the fire ring. "So, Cooper, what about those local legends you mentioned earlier? Figure this is prime storytelling time." I glanced at Natalie, who was running her fingers through the doll's hair in long, gentle strokes. The way she held it reminded me of how my sister used to cradle her stuffed animals when we were kids, except Natalie was 28 years old, and this thing looked disturbingly real in the firelight. "Well, there's the usual stuff," I said, trying to focus on the group instead of whatever was happening with Natalie. "Native American burial grounds, old logging camps where accidents happened, nothing too exciting." Wesley leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What about missing hikers? Any good ghost stories?" "A few over the years, but mostly people just get turned around. Cell service is spotty out here, so folks panic when they can't call for help." I kept my tone casual, not wanting to spook anyone. "Stick with the group tomorrow and you'll be fine." Violet adjusted her camera settings, probably trying to capture the firelight. "What about children? Any stories involving kids?" The question made me pause. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. Old places like this usually have stories about children who got lost or..." She trailed off, glancing at Natalie. Natalie looked up from the doll, her eyes bright with interest. "Yes, tell us about the children." Something in her voice made my skin crawl. Not the words themselves, but the eagerness behind them. Like she already knew something I didn't. "There was a family that went missing back in the 1980s, I said slowly. "The Hendersons. Parents and 2 young daughters. They were camping somewhere in this general area, but the exact location was never confirmed. Search teams found their abandoned campsite, but no trace of the family." Natalie's hand stilled on the doll's hair. "What happened to them?" "Nobody knows. The official report listed it as a voluntary disappearance, suggesting they might have been running from debt or legal troubles. But the local rangers always suspected something else." "Like what?" Tommy asked. I shrugged. Could have been anything. Animal attack, getting lost, falling into a ravine. The wilderness doesn't leave much evidence after 30+ years. Albert snorted from his chair. "Probably just went to start fresh somewhere else. People do that." "Maybe." I stirred the fire again, watching the logs shift and settle. But the weird part was their campsite. Everything was still there. Food, clothes, camping gear, even the car keys. Who abandons their vehicle if they're planning to disappear? The fire crackled and popped, filling the silence that followed. Natalie had gone back to stroking the doll's hair, but now she was humming softly under her breath. A tune I didn't recognize, sweet and lilting like a lullaby. "That's beautiful," Violet said. "What song is that?" Natalie looked up, blinking like she'd forgotten we were there. "Song? Oh, I'm not sure. It just came to me." Tommy shifted in his chair. "You've been humming it on and off all day." "Have I?" Natalie tilted her head, considering this. I hadn't noticed. The humming resumed, and I found myself listening more carefully to the melody. It did sound familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have heard it before. Something about it made me think of childhood, of being very young and safe and cared for. "Do you hear that?" Natalie asked suddenly. her head turning toward the darkness beyond our circle of firelight. I listened. Wind through the trees, the creek babbling nearby, an owl hooting somewhere to the north. Normal forest sounds. "Hear what?" Wesley asked. "The voices. Children's voices." Natalie's grip on the doll tightened. "They're singing along." I strained to pick out anything that might sound like voices, but all I caught were the usual nocturnal sounds: rustling leaves, small animals moving through underbrush, the distant crack of a branch settling. Nothing that resembled human speech, let alone children singing. Tommy leaned toward Natalie, his voice gentle. "I don't hear anything like that. Maybe you're letting your imagination run wild a little?" Natalie's head snapped toward him, and for a second her expression was fierce. "I know what I'm hearing, Tommy. Just because you can't hear them doesn't mean they're not there." Okay. Tommy held up his hands. "I didn't mean anything by it." But Natalie had already turned away, focusing on the doll again. She adjusted its position in her lap, making sure the yellow dress was spread out properly, then resumed the gentle hair stroking. The humming started up again, too, that same haunting melody. I watched her face in the firelight, noting the soft expression she wore while looking at the doll. It was the kind of look you'd give a real child. Protective, affectionate, completely absorbed. The whole thing was getting more unsettling by the hour. "Well," I said, standing and stretching, "we've got an early start tomorrow, so I'm thinking we should start winding down soon." Albert was already yawning. "Sounds good to me. This mountain air is making me tired." One by one, the group began their bedtime routines. Violet packed away her camera equipment, Wesley banked the fire, Tommy headed for the creek to brush his teeth. I made my usual rounds, checking that food was properly secured and everyone had what they needed for the night. Natalie was the last to move, finally standing and cradling the doll against her chest. "Come on, sweetheart," she murmured to it. "Time for bed." I pretended to be busy organizing my pack while watching her carry the doll to her tent. She disappeared inside for several minutes, and I could hear her moving around, probably setting up her sleeping bag and getting changed. When she emerged to use the bathroom area, the doll was no longer with her. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Perfect." She smiled at me, but something about it seemed forced. "Just getting ready for sleep." I nodded and finished my own preparations, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my tent listening to the forest sounds, thinking about Natalie's behavior and wondering if I should have been more direct about my concerns. The whole situation felt like it was building towards something, though I couldn't guess what. Sometime around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of a tent zipper. Not unusual, people got up to use the bathroom all the time. But after several minutes passed without hearing footsteps returning, I started to worry. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped my own tent. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting barely enough light to see the other tents. Natalie's was dark, but when I aimed my flashlight at it, I could see the entrance was hanging open. Empty. I pulled on my boots and jacket, then started searching the immediate area. Her footprints were easy to follow in the soft dirt. They led away from camp toward the deeper woods, heading roughly northwest. I followed the trail for about 100 yards, moving carefully to avoid making noise. My flashlight beam swept back and forth, picking out broken twigs and disturbed leaves that marked her passage. The tracks were deliberate, not wandering like someone who was lost or sleepwalking. Then I heard her voice. It was coming from somewhere ahead, soft and conversational. I clicked off my flashlight and moved forward more slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. A few steps later, I could make out a pale shape in a small clearing between 2 large pine trees. Natalie sat cross-legged on the ground with the doll positioned directly in front of her, facing her like they were having a tea party. Except instead of toy cups and saucers, there was just the 2 of them in the middle of the dark woods. "I know you're worried," Natalie was saying in a gentle, soothing tone. "But we're going to find her, I promise. Can you tell me which direction she went?" She paused, head tilted slightly like she was listening to something. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound that might explain what she was responding to. Nothing but wind and the distant creek. "Okay, that makes sense," Natalie continued. "She probably got scared and ran. Little ones do that when they're confused." Another pause. This time she nodded, as if the doll had given her useful information. No, you did the right thing by staying put. Someone had to wait here in case she came back looking for you." I stepped closer, trying to get a better view without revealing myself. Natalie's posture was relaxed and attentive, exactly like someone engaged in a real conversation. She reached out and adjusted the doll's dress, smoothing down a wrinkle. "How long has she been gone?" Natalie asked. "Since yesterday? Oh, sweetie, she must be so frightened." The whole scene was deeply wrong. Not just the obvious fact that she was talking to an inanimate object, but the way she was doing it. This wasn't play acting or imagination. She genuinely seemed to believe she was receiving answers. I was debating whether to interrupt when Natalie suddenly looked up, her eyes wide and startled in the darkness. Even without my flashlight, I could see the fear on her face. "Cooper?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Cooper, is that you?" I turned on my flashlight, keeping the beam low so it wouldn't blind her. "Yeah, it's me. What are you doing out here, Natalie?" She looked down at the doll, then back at me, and I saw something like panic flicker across her features. "She told me about her friend. There's a little girl lost somewhere in these woods. She's been missing since yesterday, and she's scared and alone." I moved closer, noting how Natalie's hands were shaking as she held the doll. "Natalie, listen to me. There are no children registered for camping in this area. I checked the permits before we came out here. But she's here," Natalie insisted, her voice rising with urgency. "She's lost, and we have to find her before something terrible happens." Tommy's snoring drifted across the campsite from his tent, a steady rhythm that should have been comforting. Instead, I found myself counting the seconds between each breath, using it as an anchor while I listened for any movement from Natalie's tent. The zipper hadn't moved since we'd gotten back to camp 20 minutes ago, but I could hear her voice through the thin nylon walls. She was still talking to the doll. The conversation had a different quality now than what I'd witnessed in the clearing. Her words came faster, more urgent, punctuated by longer pauses as if she was receiving detailed instructions. I caught fragments when the night breeze shifted the right way. Something about tomorrow morning and she can't wait much longer. And I promise I'll find you. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to find a position that didn't make the fabric rustle. The last thing I wanted was to alert Natalie that I was listening. Part of me wondered if I should wake the others, get Wesley or Tommy to help me figure out what to do. But what would I tell them? That one of our group members was having detailed conversations with a doll about a missing child who didn't exist? Even thinking it made me sound crazy. Around 3 a.m, Natalie's voice finally went quiet. I waited another hour before I allowed myself to relax enough to doze, but real sleep never came. Every small sound in the forest, a branch creaking, an owl calling, the distant splash of something moving through the creek, had me wide awake again, listening for the sound of that tent zipper. When the first pale light started filtering through the trees, I gave up on sleep entirely. I unzipped my tent as quietly as possible and crawled out into the cool morning air. The fire had died down to cold ashes, and a thin layer of dew covered everything in the campsite. Natalie's tent was still zipped shut, but I could see movement inside, a restless shifting that suggested she hadn't slept much either. I was trying to decide whether to start the fire or give everyone more time to sleep, when Natalie's tent zipper opened with a sharp metallic sound that seemed to echo through the quiet campsite. She emerged clutching the doll against her chest, her hair tangled and her clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them. But it was her face that made me take a step back. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, darting around the campsite like she was seeing things that weren't there. Her skin had a pale, almost grayish quality, and there were dark circles under her eyes that made her look like she'd been sick for weeks. "Good morning," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice calm and normal. Natalie turned toward me, but it took a moment for her eyes to focus on my face. When they did, she smiled, but it was wrong somehow. Too bright and too eager. "She's been calling all night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you hear her? She's getting weaker." I felt my stomach drop. "Natalie, who's been calling?" "The little girl." She adjusted her grip on the doll, cradling it more carefully. "She's scared. She's been lost for so long and she's running out of time." Before I could respond, Natalie started pacing. She moved in a tight circuit around the center of the campsite, from the dead fire ring to the edge of the creek and back again. Her steps were quick and agitated, and she kept looking over her shoulder toward the woods beyond the water. "We have to find her today," she continued, her voice getting louder. "She can't wait another night. She's so cold and hungry, and there are things in the woods that—" She stopped abruptly, tilting her head like she was listening to something. I strained my ears, but heard nothing except the normal morning sounds of the forest. Birds calling to each other, the gentle babble of the creek, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "What things?" I asked. Natalie shook her head rapidly. She doesn't want to talk about them, but they're getting closer. We have to hurry. The sound of a tent zipper made us both turn. Tommy emerged from his tent, yawning and stretching. He took one look at Natalie and his expression shifted from sleepy confusion to concern. "Everything okay?" he asked, looking between us. "Natalie's been up most of the night," I said carefully. Tommy watched her pace for a few seconds. "Nat, you feeling all right?" She stopped moving and stared at him like she'd forgotten he was there. "We need to start breakfast quickly. As soon as everyone's ready, we're going to find her." "Find who?" "The lost little girl. I know where she is now." Natalie pointed toward the woods on the far side of the creek, where the trees grew thick and close together. "She's been trying to tell me all night. She's about a mile that way, near a big rock that looks like a sleeping bear." Tommy shot me a look that clearly said he thought Natalie had lost it completely. I gave him a small shake of my head, hoping he'd understand that arguing with her right now wasn't going to help. The sound of more zippers announced that the others were waking up. Wesley emerged first, followed by Violet, and finally Albert, who looked like he'd slept about as well as I had. They all noticed Natalie's agitated state immediately. "What's going on?" Wesley asked. "Natalie thinks she knows where to find a missing child," Tommy said. "A little girl who's been lost in the woods." Violet's face immediately filled with concern. "Oh my God, really? We should call for help right away." "That's what I'm going to do," I said, pulling my satellite phone from my pack. "Let me try to reach my supervisor." I moved a few yards away from the group and powered up the phone. The signal indicator showed only one bar, but it was better than nothing. I dialed Bodie's number and waited through several rings before it connected. "Bodie, it's Cooper," I said when I heard his voice crackle through the static. "I'm at the Willow Creek site and I need—" The line cut out. I tried again, but this time I couldn't even get a dial tone. The signal had disappeared entirely. I walked to higher ground near the edge of the campsite and tried once more. This time the call went through, but the connection was worse than before. "Bodie, can you hear me?" "Cooper? You're breaking up. What's the situation?" "I've got a client who believes there's a missing child in the area. She's becoming increasingly agitated, and I'm concerned about—" Static overwhelmed the line again. I caught fragments of Bodie's response, something about protocol and local authorities. But then the call dropped completely. I tried calling back 3 more times, but couldn't get through. The best I could do was leave a voicemail message during a brief moment when the connection held. "Bodie, this is Cooper at Willow Creek. I have a situation with a client who believes there's a missing child. I may need backup or guidance on how to handle this. Call me back when you get this." When I returned to the group, Natalie was standing perfectly still in the center of the campsite, staring at me with intense focus. "What did they say?" she demanded. "Are they sending a search team?" "I couldn't get through clearly," I said. "The connection was too poor." But Natalie's face lit up like I'd just confirmed her worst fears. They already know about her, don't they? That's why the phone isn't working properly. They're trying to coordinate the search from their end. I opened my mouth to explain that satellite phones often had connectivity issues in dense forest, but Wesley spoke first. "Wait, so there really is a missing child out here?" "Yes," Natalie said firmly. "And every minute we waste, she gets more scared and more lost." Albert rubbed his eyes. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but shouldn't we let the professionals handle this? If there's really a kid missing, park rangers or police should be the ones looking." "There isn't time," Natalie snapped. "She's been out there for 2 days already. By the time we hike back to get help and bring them back here, it could be too late." She clutched the doll tighter and looked around at all of us with desperate eyes. "I'm going to find her, with or without your help." Tommy stepped forward. "Natalie, you can't just wander off into the woods by yourself. That's dangerous. More dangerous than leaving a scared little girl alone out there." She gestured toward the forest beyond the creek. "I know exactly where she is. She's been telling me all night. All I have to do is follow the stream until I reach the bare rock, then head uphill toward the old pine with the broken top." The level of detail in her description made my blood run cold. Either Natalie was having incredibly specific hallucinations or something was feeding her information about the local terrain. Neither possibility was good. Violet looked torn between concern and confusion. "If you really think you know where she is, maybe we should all go together. Safety in numbers, right?" "No," I said quickly. "We shouldn't split up, and we definitely shouldn't go chasing after something that might not even be real." Natalie rounded on me, her eyes flashing with anger. "You think I'm making this up? You think I'm crazy?" "I think you're under a lot of stress, and stress can make people—" "I know what I heard," she cut me off. "I know what she told me. And if you won't help me save her, then I'll do it myself." She turned and started walking toward the creek, still carrying the doll. "Natalie, stop," I called after her. "You can't just—" But she was already stepping into the shallow water, moving toward the far bank with determined strides. The current wasn't strong, but the rocks were slippery, and she was carrying the doll in one arm while trying to maintain her balance. Tommy looked at me with panic in his eyes. "We can't just let her go alone." I felt trapped between two terrible options. Let Natalie wander into the dense woods by herself in her current mental state, or lead the entire group on what was almost certainly a wild chase after something that didn't exist. But watching her wade across the creek, clutching that doll and muttering reassurances to an imaginary child, I knew I didn't really have a choice. "Everyone pack light," I said, grabbing my day pack and checking that my first aid kit was inside. "Water, snacks, emergency supplies only. We'll do a limited search to keep her safe, but we're staying together and we're not going more than a mile from camp." Wesley nodded and started breaking down his tent. "How long do we give this?" 2 hours maximum. If we don't find anything concrete by then, we're coming back and I'm hiking out to get real help." Albert grumbled about the whole situation being insane, but he packed his gear without further argument. Violet grabbed her camera and a water bottle. Tommy shoved energy bars into his pockets. By the time we were ready, Natalie had reached the far side of the creek and was standing at the edge of the forest, looking back at us with impatience. "She's getting weaker," she called across the water. "We have to hurry." I led the group across the creek, testing each step carefully on the slippery rocks. The water was cold enough to make my legs ache, and I could hear Albert muttering complaints behind me, but we all made it across without anyone falling. On the far bank, Natalie was already pushing through the undergrowth between 2 large oak trees. The forest here was much denser than the area around our campsite, with thick tangles of brush and fallen logs that made walking difficult. "Stay close," I called to the group. "Watch for low branches and holes in the ground." Natalie moved ahead of us with surprising confidence, navigating around obstacles like she'd walked this route before. She kept the doll pressed against her chest with one arm while using the other to push aside branches and vines. "This way," she said, angling slightly uphill. "She says we're getting closer." My legs burned from pushing through the tangled undergrowth for what felt like hours, though my watch showed only 30 minutes had passed. Branches caught at my sleeves and scratched across my face as I followed Natalie deeper into terrain I'd never explored in all my years guiding these trails. She moved with that same unsettling confidence, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under low-hanging branches like she'd walked this exact route countless times before. The doll never left her arms. She cradled it against her chest with one hand, while using the other to push aside thorny vines and navigate around moss-covered boulders. Every few minutes she'd pause and tilt her head toward the doll's face, listening to something none of us could hear. "This way," she called back to us, angling left around a massive deadfall. "She says we're almost there." Behind me, Albert's breathing came in short, labored puffs. The man was clearly struggling with the pace and terrain, but he hadn't complained once since we'd started this search. Violet stayed close to her husband, offering him water from her bottle every time we stopped. Wesley brought up the rear, his face set in grim determination but his eyes darting nervously between the trees. Tommy had fallen silent after the first 10 minutes. He'd stopped asking Natalie questions about where exactly we were going and just focused on keeping up. I could see the worry etched across his features every time I glanced back at the group. The forest around us grew denser with each step. Ancient pines towered overhead, their canopies so thick that only scattered patches of morning light reached the forest floor. The air felt cooler here, almost damp, and carried scents I couldn't identify. Moss covered everything. Fallen logs, exposed roots, even some of the standing trees wore thick green sleeves up their trunks. "Cooper," Wesley's voice cut through the quiet sounds of our movement. "How much further are we going?" I looked ahead to where Natalie had stopped beside another enormous tree, this one easily 5 feet across at its base. She stood perfectly still, both arms wrapped around the doll, staring at something near the tree's roots. "Natalie found something," I called back to Wesley, though dread was already settling in my stomach. The way she stood there, completely motionless, reminded me too much of how she'd looked when we discovered the first doll. I pushed through a cluster of ferns and reached her side. She was breathing fast, shallow breaths that misted in the cool air. "Look," she whispered, pointing with one finger while keeping the doll secured against her body. My eyes followed her gesture to the base of the massive pine. There, propped against the trunk in almost the exact same position as the first doll, sat another figure. But this one was different, bigger. The second doll was easily twice the size of the one Natalie carried. Where hers represented maybe a 4 or 5-year-old child, this one looked like it could be 8 or 9. And instead of a yellow dress, this doll wore boys' clothing. Dark blue jeans, a red flannel shirt, and small hiking boots that looked disturbingly real. But what made my skin crawl was how lifelike it appeared. The first doll had been realistic, sure, but this one seemed to breathe. Its chest rose and fell in a gentle rhythm, and its eyes, closed as if sleeping, showed the faint movement of dreams behind the lids. "Oh my God!" Natalie gasped, rushing forward before I could stop her. "It's him! It's the brother!" She knelt beside the larger doll, careful not to disturb it, but leaning close enough to study its face. The thing, and I couldn't think of it as anything else now, had brown hair styled in a typical little boy's cut, slightly mussed like he'd been running through the woods. Its skin held the same pink flush of health as the girl doll, and its lips were parted slightly as if it might speak at any moment. "Natalie, don't touch it," I said, moving closer but keeping my distance from both dolls. "I won't hurt him," she replied, her voice taking on that soft maternal tone she used with the girl doll. "He's sleeping. She says he's been sleeping here, waiting for someone to find him." The rest of the group caught up to us, and I heard Violet's sharp intake of breath when she spotted the second doll. Albert stopped dead in his tracks, his face going pale. "What the hell is going on here?" Albert demanded, his voice louder than it should have been in the quiet forest. "Who's leaving these things out here?" "They're not things," Natalie snapped without taking her eyes off the sleeping boy doll. "They're children. Lost children who need our help." Wesley moved to stand beside his father-in-law, both men staring at the scene with obvious discomfort. Tommy approached more slowly, his face a mix of concern and growing alarm. "Natalie," Tommy said carefully, "you found another doll, that's all this is. Someone's been leaving dolls in the woods." "You're wrong." Natalie's voice carried absolute certainty. "Finding him proves we're on the right track. She told me about her brother, about how they got separated when the bad things started chasing them. He ran this way and got tired, so he sat down to rest." I pulled out my satellite phone, desperate to reach Bodhi again. We were way off any established trail now, in terrain I didn't recognize, following a woman who was clearly having some kind of breakdown. The situation had moved far beyond what I could handle on my own. The phone's display showed 1 bar of signal. I moved away from the group, climbing onto a fallen log to get a few more feet of elevation, and dialed Bodhi's number. This time, he answered on the first ring. "Cooper? Where are you?" His voice came through clearly, and there was an urgency in his tone that immediately put me on edge. "We're about a mile northwest of our campsite," I said, keeping my voice low. "We've been following the creek upstream, then headed into dense forest. Natalie found another doll." "Another one?" The line went quiet for several seconds. "Cooper, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Gather your group and get out of there. Now." "What's going on, Bodhi? What aren't you telling me?" "There's no time to explain. Just trust me on this. Get everyone together and head back to your campsite immediately. Don't let anyone touch those dolls, and whatever you do, don't let that woman take them with you." The connection started to crackle with static, but I could still make out his words. "Bodhi, I need to know what I'm dealing with here. Natalie thinks there are missing children, and she's not going to leave willingly. Cooper, you're in danger. All of you. Those dolls, they're not what they appear to be. Get your people out of there before—" The line went dead. I stared at the phone's blank screen, my hands shaking slightly. In all the years I'd worked for Bodhi, I'd never heard that level of fear in his voice. I climbed down from the log and walked back to where the group stood around the 2 dolls. Natalie had positioned herself between the girl and boy dolls, speaking softly to both of them in turn. The sight made my stomach turn. "Everyone, we need to leave," I announced, trying to keep my voice calm and authoritative. "We're heading back to camp right now." "What?" Natalie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We can't leave. We just found him. We're so close to finding the real children." "My supervisor just called. We have to evacuate the area immediately. It's not safe here." Albert looked relieved and Wesley nodded grimly. Violet was already shouldering her camera bag, but Natalie remained kneeling between the dolls, shaking her head vigorously. "No," she said, her voice rising. "No, we can't leave them. The children are counting on us. She told me they're getting weaker, that the bad things are getting closer. If we leave now, we might never find them. Natalie, there are no missing children," I said as gently as I could manage. "I checked the permit records. No families with children are registered for camping in this area." "You're wrong." She clutched the girl doll tighter and leaned protectively over the boy doll. "They're here. They're lost and scared, and they need us. How can you just abandon them?" Tommy stepped forward, his face creased with worry and frustration. "Natalie, please, look at what you're saying. You're talking to dolls. Plastic and fabric dolls. There are no children." "Don't you dare," Natalie snarled, rising to her feet with the girl doll pressed against her chest. "Don't you dare dismiss what I know to be true. I can hear them. I can feel their fear. These aren't just dolls. They're connected to something real. Something that needs our help." "Connected how?" Tommy's voice took on a pleading quality. "Natalie, you're scaring me. This isn't like you. You're talking about hearing voices and having conversations with toys. That's not normal." Natalie's face flushed red with anger. "Normal? You think any of this is normal? Finding these children out here, feeling their terror, knowing they're depending on us to save them? Maybe normal isn't what matters right now, Tommy. Maybe what matters is doing the right thing." "The right thing is getting you help," Tommy shot back, his own voice rising. "Not indulging this fantasy about talking dolls and missing kids that don't exist." "They do exist!" Natalie screamed, her voice echoing through the trees. "Just because you can't hear them doesn't mean they're not real. Just because you don't understand doesn't mean I'm crazy." I stepped between them before the argument could escalate further. "We're leaving, now. That's not a request. It's an order. Everyone pack up whatever you brought and we're heading back to camp." "I won't go." Natalie backed toward the tree where the boy doll sat, positioning herself like a barrier between us and both figures. "I won't abandon these children. If you want to run away because you're too scared or too selfish to help, then go. But I'm staying." Wesley spoke up from behind me. "Cooper, we can't just leave her here alone." "She's not staying," I said firmly. "Natalie, I understand you believe these children are real, but my supervisor has information about this area that makes it dangerous for us to remain. We have to go." "What information?" she demanded. "What did he tell you?" I hesitated. Bodhi hadn't explained anything, just ordered us to leave. But the fear in his voice had been real, and that was enough for me. He said we're in danger, all of us, and he specifically mentioned the dolls. Natalie's expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like triumph. "He knows about them. That proves I'm right. There really are missing children, and your supervisor knows about it." "That's not what he said." "It's exactly what he said." Natalie's voice took on a manic edge. "He knows about the dolls because they're connected to the missing children. The authorities have been looking for these kids, and now we've found them. We can't leave now." Tommy moved closer to his friend, his hands raised peacefully. "Natalie, please, just come back to camp with us. We can call for help from there, get the proper authorities involved. You don't have to carry this burden alone." For a moment, I thought she might listen to him. Her grip on the girl doll loosened slightly, and some of the rigid tension left her shoulders. But then she glanced down at the doll's face, and whatever she saw there hardened her resolve. "She's afraid I'll leave her," Natalie whispered. "She's been alone so long, and now she's terrified I'll abandon her like everyone else did." "Natalie," Tommy started forward. "No!" She spun away from him, clutching the doll protectively. "I won't let you take me away from them. I won't let you make me abandon children who need help." She started backing deeper into the forest, moving away from our group toward a thick stand of pine trees. Tommy followed her, his voice taking on a desperate quality. "Don't do this. Don't run into the woods. You'll get lost, and then we'll have a real emergency on our hands." "I know these woods," Natalie called back, still retreating. "She's been showing me the way. I know exactly where I'm going." "No, you don't." Tommy broke into a run, trying to catch up to her before she disappeared into the dense undergrowth. "Natalie, stop." But she was already pushing through a gap between two large pines, the yellow dress of her doll visible for just a moment before the branches closed behind them. Tommy plunged after her, calling her name. "Tommy, wait!" I shouted, but he was already gone, swallowed by the same thick vegetation that had hidden Natalie. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where both of them had vanished, my mind racing through options. The boy doll remained propped against the tree, its chest still rising and falling in that disturbingly lifelike rhythm. Albert, Violet, and Wesley clustered behind me, all of them looking to me for guidance I didn't feel qualified to give. The forest had gone completely silent around us, as if even the birds were holding their breath. I grabbed Albert's arm and pointed toward where Tommy and Natalie had disappeared. "We're going after them right now." Albert nodded, his face pale but determined. Violet shouldered her camera bag without a word, and Wesley moved closer to the group. I looked back at the boy doll one last time, its chest still rising and falling in that impossible rhythm, then pushed through the gap between the pine trees where I'd last seen them. The undergrowth was thicker here, branches catching at our clothes and packs. I could make out a faint trail of broken twigs and disturbed leaves where they'd passed through. Albert stayed right behind me, breathing hard but keeping pace. Violet and Wesley followed, stepping carefully over fallen logs and around moss-covered rocks. "Tommy," I called out. "Natalie." My voice seemed to get swallowed by the dense canopy above us. No response came back. We pushed deeper into the woods, following what I hoped were their tracks. Every few yards I'd stop and scan the ground, looking for footprints in the soft earth or more broken vegetation. The forest felt different here, older, quieter. Even our footsteps seemed muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles and moss. "There," Wesley said, pointing to a scuffed area near the base of another massive pine. "Looks like someone slipped here." I knelt down and examined the marks, boot treads pressed into the damp soil, definitely from our group. The pattern continued ahead, angling downhill toward what sounded like running water. We followed the trail for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. The sound of water grew louder, and eventually we emerged at the edge of a small stream that cut through the forest floor. The water moved fast over smooth rocks, maybe 3 feet wide and ankle deep. Albert wiped sweat from his forehead. "Which way now?" I studied both directions along the stream bank. To the left, the water curved around a bend and disappeared behind a cluster of birch trees. To the right, it stretched straight for maybe 50 yards before turning again. No obvious signs of passage either way. "We split up," I said. "Albert and Violet, you two check upstream. Wesley and I will go downstream. Stay within shouting distance and call out every few minutes." Violet adjusted her pack straps. "What if we find them?" "Shout for the rest of us. Don't approach alone if something seems wrong." Albert and Violet headed upstream, picking their way carefully along the rocky bank. Wesley and I went the other direction, calling Tommy and Natalie's names every 30 seconds or so. The stream babbled loudly enough that I worried our voices wouldn't carry very far. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Wesley grabbed my shoulder. "There," he said, pointing across the stream. I followed his gaze and saw a flash of yellow fabric through the trees on the far bank. We splashed across the shallow water, boots slipping on the smooth stones, and pushed through a screen of low-hanging branches. Natalie sat on the ground with her back against a fallen log, knees drawn up to her chest. The girl doll was clutched tight in her arms, its yellow dress muddy and torn. Her own clothes were ripped in several places, dirt streaked across her face and hands. She rocked back and forth slowly, staring straight ahead with unfocused eyes. "Natalie," I said, approaching carefully. "Where's Tommy?" She didn't look at me, just kept rocking, holding the doll like it was the most precious thing in the world. Wesley knelt down beside her. "Natalie, are you hurt? What happened?" Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a flat, monotone voice, "They have him." "Who has him?" I asked. "Where did he go?" "They took him instead." She turned the doll slightly, adjusting its dress with shaking fingers. The dolls needed someone. Wesley shot me a worried look. I called out for Albert and Violet, my voice echoing through the trees. Within a few minutes, I heard them crashing through the undergrowth, and they appeared at the edge of the clearing. Violet gasped when she saw Natalie's condition. Albert just stared, his mouth hanging open. "Natalie," I tried again. "We need to find Tommy. Can you tell us which direction he went?" She looked up at me then, but her eyes seemed to look right through me. "They needed someone," she repeated. "The dolls. They were so lonely." I spent the next hour trying to get more information out of her, but she just kept repeating variations of the same thing. Tommy was gone. They had taken him. The dolls needed someone. No matter how I phrased the questions, her answers never changed or provided any useful details. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, and I knew we needed to get back to camp before dark. I helped Natalie to her feet. She came along willingly enough, still clutching the doll, and we began the long trek back through the dense forest. It took us nearly 2 hours to find our way back to the campsite. Natalie walked mechanically, never letting go of the doll, never speaking unless we asked her direct questions. Even then, her answers were the same robotic phrases about them taking Tommy and the dolls needing someone. Back at camp, I got Natalie settled in her tent with some food and water, though she barely touched either. The doll never left her arms. Violet tried talking to her, woman to woman, but got the same vacant stares and repeated phrases. As soon as I had a clear signal, I called Bodie again on the satellite phone. "Cooper, thank God," he said when he picked up. "Are you out of there? We have a problem. One of my clients is missing, Tommy Montgomery. He disappeared chasing after Natalie when she ran into the woods." Silence on the other end for several seconds. "Bodie, how long has he been gone?" I checked my watch. About 6 hours now. We found the woman, but she's not making much sense. Keeps saying they took him, but won't explain who or where. I'm calling in a search and rescue team. Get everyone packed and ready to move to the trailhead. The rangers will want to interview all of you. "Already working on it," I said, watching Wesley help Albert stuff gear into his pack. "What's really going on out here, Bodie? You knew something about those dolls. Not over the phone. Just get your people out safely." The search and rescue teams arrived at first light the next morning. 3 separate crews with trained dogs, plus a helicopter that circled overhead for hours. I led them back to the area where we'd lost Tommy, showed them the spot with the boy doll, which was still there, still breathing, and the stream where we'd found Natalie. The dogs picked up scent trails but kept losing them in confusing patterns that didn't make sense to the handlers. One dog would follow a trail for 50 yards, then sit down and whine, refusing to go further. Another would track in circles around the same area for 20 minutes before giving up entirely. Day 2 brought more teams, more sophisticated equipment, ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging cameras, additional helicopter sweeps. They found absolutely nothing. No trace of Tommy Montgomery anywhere in those woods. By day 3, the official search was scaled back to just periodic sweeps. The lead ranger explained to me that after 72 hours without finding any sign of a missing person in terrain this dense, the chances of a successful rescue dropped dramatically. I stayed all 3 days helping coordinate the search efforts and answering the same questions over and over. Where exactly had I last seen Tommy? What was his state of mind? Had he been drinking or taking any medications? Did he have experience in wilderness survival? Natalie was interviewed by park rangers, local police, and eventually a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma cases. She gave the same responses to everyone. They took him. The dolls needed someone. They took him instead. The psychiatrist recommended observation at a regional medical facility, but her family refused and took her home after signing various liability waivers. On the evening of the 3rd day, Bodie arrived at the Pine Ridge parking area where the search teams had set up their command post. He found me sitting on a picnic table, staring at the tree line where this whole nightmare had started. Rough few days, he said, settling onto the bench beside me. Worst I've ever had. That's 15 years of guiding groups through these woods, and I've never lost someone. Never even had a serious injury. Bodhi was quiet for a long moment, watching the last helicopter make its final sweep before heading back to base. This isn't the first time, he said finally. I looked at him. What do you mean? Pine Ridge. This specific area. We've had 7 people go missing here over the past 15 years. Always the same pattern. What pattern? Bodhi pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. First incident was in 2008. A family camping here reported finding a realistic doll near their campsite. Teenage daughter became obsessed with it, claimed it was talking to her. She disappeared the second night. Never found. My stomach dropped. 7 people? 2010. A college student on a solo hiking trip. Found a doll. Started hearing children's voices. Gone. 2012, a married couple. The wife found a doll. Became convinced there were lost children in the woods. Husband tried to stop her from going after them. She vanished, he made it out, but had some kind of breakdown. Couldn't remember details. Bodhi kept reading from his notes. 2014, 2016, 2018. Always the same elements. Someone finds a doll that looks disturbingly real. They become convinced it's connected to missing children. They hear voices calling for help. They go into the woods to rescue these children, and they never come back. Why didn't you tell me this before I brought a group here? Because we've never been able to prove any connection. The dolls disappear. The missing people are never found. No evidence of foul play. No patterns the authorities can track. Officially, these are just unfortunate wilderness accidents in a challenging terrain. I thought about Tommy's face when he'd chased after Natalie, the concern in his voice when he'd tried to reason with her. But you don't think they're accidents? I think there's something in those woods that uses the dolls as bait, something that feeds on people's desire to help, to rescue, to protect the innocent. Bodhi closed his notebook. And I think it just claimed another victim. The weight of Bodhi's words settled over the quiet parking area like a heavy blanket. I stared at him across the picnic table, trying to process what he'd just told me about the 7 missing people and the pattern of dolls. The command post around us had mostly emptied out as the search teams packed up their equipment for the night. There's something else I need to tell you, Cooper. Bodhi's voice carried a different tone now, less authoritative and more apologetic. He pulled off his baseball cap and ran his fingers through his graying hair. Something about why I sent you and your group to Pine Ridge specifically. I felt my stomach tighten. What do you mean, specifically? Bodhi looked down at his hands folded on the table. I didn't assign you to Pine Ridge randomly. I've been tracking these incidents for years, documenting every detail I could gather. But here's the problem. Every single report came from amateur hikers, families on vacation, college kids, casual weekend campers, people with no real wilderness experience and no credibility with the authorities. The pieces started falling into place, and I didn't like the picture they were forming. You wanted a professional witness. I needed someone I could trust to give me an accurate account of what actually happens out there. Someone with wilderness training who could observe details and remember them clearly under stress. Someone whose word would carry weight with search and rescue teams and park officials. Bodhi met my eyes. I needed an experienced guide to witness the phenomenon firsthand. I pushed back from the table, anger flaring in my chest. You sent us there as bait. You knew about the dolls, you knew about the disappearances, and you sent my group into that area anyway. I thought you'd be safe. You're trained for emergency situations. You carry satellite communication. You know how to handle difficult clients. I believed your professional experience would protect you and your group from whatever happens to the others. Tommy Montgomery is missing because you used us as unwitting investigators. The words came out harder than I intended. you gambled with our lives for your research." Bodhi nodded slowly. "You're right. I made a calculated decision to put you and your clients at risk without your informed consent. I told myself it was necessary, that we needed professional confirmation to develop future safety protocols. But that doesn't change the fact that I used you." I stood up from the picnic table, pacing a few steps toward the tree line before turning back. The forest looked different now in the fading light, darker and more threatening than it ever had during my years of guiding tours through these mountains. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the 2016 incident. A geology professor from the university went missing after his graduate students reported he'd become obsessed with a doll he found near Willow Creek. That was the first time someone with scientific training had encountered the phenomenon, but he disappeared before he could document anything useful." Bodhi closed his notebook and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "I've been waiting for the right opportunity to send someone qualified into that area ever since. And you picked me because I'm expendable. I picked you because you're competent, because you have 15 years of wilderness experience and a perfect safety record, because I trusted you to handle whatever you encountered and come back with answers." Bodhi's voice dropped. "I was wrong about the safety part, obviously. But you did come back with confirmation of everything I suspected. I thought about Natalie sitting in her tent, clutching that doll and speaking to it like it was a real child. About the boy doll breathing against the pine tree. About Tommy chasing after her into the woods and never coming out. Your confirmation cost Tommy his life." "Yes, it did, and I'll have to live with that decision for the rest of my career." Bodhi stood up and shouldered his pack. "I'm sorry, Cooper. I know that doesn't bring Tommy back or undo what happened to Natalie, but I am genuinely sorry for putting you in that position without telling you the truth." I stared at him for a long moment, weighing everything he'd told me against everything I'd experienced over the past 3 days. The search teams, the interviews, the complete lack of any trace of Tommy despite dozens of trained professionals combing through square miles of forest. What happens now? Now the area gets quietly removed from official camping recommendations. No formal restrictions, nothing that would draw attention or require explanations, but Pine Ridge won't appear on any new trail maps or wilderness guides. The incidents will stay classified as individual accidents in challenging terrain. And the next time someone finds a doll out there, hopefully there won't be a next time. Sometimes these things go dormant for years or even decades. But if it does happen again, at least we'll have your account to help us understand what we're dealing with. I walked back to the picnic table and grabbed my gear bag. I quit. Cooper, I understand you're angry, but I quit. I'm done guiding tours. I'm done with wilderness work, and I'm done with this company. I slung the bag over my shoulder. Find yourself another unwitting investigator for the next time you want to test a theory. Bodhi didn't try to argue or convince me to reconsider. He just nodded and watched as I walked toward my truck. Where will you go? Somewhere with streetlights and traffic noise and absolutely no remote wilderness areas. I opened the driver's door and threw my bag into the passenger seat. Somewhere I never have to wonder what's watching me from the trees. 3 weeks later, I was living in a studio apartment in Portland, Oregon, working for the city parks department, maintaining urban green spaces and recreational areas. Pocket parks, community gardens, paved walking trails through residential neighborhoods. Nothing more remote than the Rose Garden in Washington Park. Nothing more challenging than trimming hedges and planting seasonal flowers. The work felt strange after 15 years of leading people through backcountry wilderness, but it was exactly what I needed. Predictable hours, clear boundaries, no overnight camping, no responsibility for other people's safety in unpredictable environments. I could go home every evening to my small apartment, order takeout, and fall asleep to the sound of traffic instead of wondering what might be moving through the forest around my tent. I tried not to think about Tommy, but that was impossible. His face kept appearing in my mind at random moments. the concern in his voice when Natalie had started acting strangely, the determination in his expression when he decided to chase after her into the woods. I found myself wondering if he'd realized what was happening in those final moments, if he'd understood that Natalie wasn't leading him to rescue a lost child, but into something far worse. The nightmares started about a month after I moved to Portland. Always the same basic elements: dolls with glass eyes that tracked my movement, the sound of children's voices calling for help from deep in the forest, Natalie's desperate insistence that we had to find them before something terrible happened. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, checking my apartment windows to make sure I was really in the city and not back at that campsite beside Willow Creek. 6 months later, I learned through a mutual friend that Natalie had been released from psychiatric observation and was undergoing outpatient therapy. According to her family, she'd made significant progress but retained no clear memories of what had happened to Tommy, or how she'd ended up alone by the stream. The doctors called it traumatic amnesia, a protective mechanism that allowed her mind to function by blocking access to experiences too disturbing to process. Part of me envied her that blank space where the worst memories should have been. I remembered every detail with painful clarity: the lifelike quality of the dolls, the way Natalie had spoken to them as if they were real children, the confident way she'd navigated through terrain she'd never seen before, the way Tommy had looked back at me before disappearing between those pine trees, trusting that I knew what I was doing and that everything would work out fine. I started doing research in my spare time, using the Portland Library's database to search for information about the Pine Ridge area and any historical incidents that might explain what we'd encountered. What I found was interesting but not particularly helpful. The region had been used as a logging camp in the early 1900s, and there were records of several fatal accidents involving heavy machinery and falling trees. Before that, it had been traditional hunting grounds for local tribes, but I couldn't find any specific legends or stories connected to dolls or missing children. What I did discover, almost by accident, was that the Pine Ridge area had been quietly removed from official camping maps sometime in the months following our incident. No formal restrictions had been implemented, no public announcements had been made, but the location simply no longer appeared in wilderness guides or Park Service recommendations. It was as if the area had been erased from official existence without any acknowledgement that it had ever been considered suitable for recreational camping. The disappearances had stopped completely after our incident. I checked missing person databases and local news reports regularly for the first year after Tommy vanished, but there were no new cases matching the pattern Bodie had described. No reports of hikers finding dolls, no incidents of people becoming obsessed with voices calling for help, no unexplained disappearances in that specific region. I developed a theory about this, though I had no way to test it or confirm my suspicions. Maybe whatever force operated in those woods had been satisfied by Tommy's disappearance. Maybe it only needed one person every few years to sustain itself, and his sacrifice had bought temporary safety for other potential victims. Maybe the dolls would remain dormant for months or years before appearing again to lure the next unsuspecting hiker into the forest. Or maybe our encounter had somehow disrupted the pattern permanently. Maybe Bodie's plan had worked in an unexpected way, not by providing professional documentation of the phenomenon, but by bringing enough attention to the area that whatever lived there had decided to retreat deeper into the wilderness or find new hunting grounds entirely. I preferred that theory, though I knew I'd never be able to prove it either way. Years passed and I settled into my new life in Portland. I got promoted to supervisor of urban park maintenance, started dating a woman who worked for the Environmental Protection Agency, moved to a larger apartment in a better neighborhood. I learned to sleep through the night without checking the windows, learned to enjoy hiking on paved trails through city parks, without constantly scanning the trees for movement. But I never forgot the lessons I'd learned during those 3 days at Pine Ridge. Some places operated beyond human understanding, following rules that had nothing to do with logic or science, or the comfortable assumption that the world made sense. Some boundaries existed for reasons that became clear only after you'd already crossed them, when it was too late to turn back and pretend you'd never seen what you'd seen. The dolls still appeared in my nightmares occasionally, always with those eerily human expressions and glass eyes that seemed to track my movement as I shifted position. Natalie's voice echoed through my dreams, desperate and certain as she insisted that the children were real and needed our help. Tommy's face looked back at me from between pine trees, trusting and determined, as he disappeared into the forest for the last time. Those dreams served as a constant reminder that survival sometimes depended on recognizing dangerous boundaries before crossing them, and that the desire to help others could be used against you by things that understood human nature better than humans understood themselves.